Thank you for joining CIE's weekly analysis of the Hamas-Israel war with some of the best analysts from around the world. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and Emory University emeritus professor of contemporary Middle Eastern history, political science, and Israel studies. Today is the 57th anniversary of the outbreak of the June 67 war, which initiated dramatic changes in Israel, in the Middle East, among world Jewry, and in the U.S.-Israel relationship. These topics, when analyzed or reviewed alone, have wide implications and could themselves have individual webinars devoted just to them. Today's guests are Dr. Asher Susser and Dr. Sarah Feuer, both in Tel Aviv. Dr. Susser is an emeritus professor of Middle Eastern history at Tel Aviv University and a senior fellow and former director of the university's Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. He's considered one of Israel's most learned scholars on the topic of Israel's neighbors. For me, I think he's the most learned. He was a visiting scholar at the Crown Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Brandeis and at the University of Arizona. His books include The Emergence of the Modern Middle East, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, The Two-State Imperative, and the Rise of Hamas in Palestine. Dr. Sarah Feuer is a specialist on Middle East and North African politics. She is a lecturer in international relations at Reichman University's Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy, and a program director at the Gazit Institute. Previously, she spent 4 years as a fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies and 7 years as a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She's the author of Regulating Islam, Religion, and the State in Morocco and Tunisia, as well as numerous policy papers and articles that have appeared in the National Interest, Foreign Affairs, Politico, among other outlets. Sarah has concentrated quite considerable amount of her time on Arab states in North Africa, and also dealing with those countries who joined the Abraham Accords in September 2020. In the days before the June war, Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban met with U.S. President Lyndon Johnson, seeking Johnson's leadership to break a recently created sea blockade to Israel's access to its southern port and lifeline for oil, Eilat. Johnson declined Eban's request, and he warned Eban as he left the conversation to return home to the Israeli cabinet led by Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. Johnson said, "If you go it alone, namely going to war, if you go it alone, you will be alone." Johnson was afraid of engaging in this building conflict for fear of enticing Russia into a confrontation with the U.S. This, of course, was the high time of the Cold War. Johnson was also keen that Washington's focus would be on prosecuting America's involvement in Vietnam. Some 57 years later, this past March, when it appeared that Israel was about to engage in a major war campaign against Hamas in the southern part of Gaza, namely Rafah, President Biden issued a similar warning to Israel about taking on a fight where Israel would be alone. And yet, unlike Johnson, Biden enveloped Israel with American support after October 7th, when terrorists assaulted and killed 1,200 Israelis and others, and dragged more than 240 kidnapped Israelis and others to Gaza. As the war has progressed to this inflection point, Israel and Hamas are tugging, jabbing, and fighting each other over whether there will be a ceasefire, exchange of hostages for Palestinian prisoners. What we wish to do today is to look at the broad context of a Hamas-Israel war over Gaza and how the 67 war greatly increased Israel's control over territories that surrounded it, that had been areas that were used by or controlled by Egyptians, Syrians, and Jordanians to attack Israelis and Israeli settlements in the period before June 67. After the war, Israel controlled the Gaza Strip, all of the West Bank, the Jordan River, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, and Jerusalem. Looking back over these 57 years, Israel has, with the urging of the U.S. and others, been asked to exchange these lands for security or exchange these lands for peace. Israel and its Arab neighbors are still engaged in the process of deciding the future political configurations of these lands. And Arab states and the Palestinians have tried to figure out what their relationships would be with Israel. And they have changed considerably in 57 years. Would they stretch from peace treaties to war and hostility, to terrorism, violence, and horrendous genocide? And finally, the US has significantly changed its relationship with Israel since June 67. It initially encouraged the UN to mediate the conflict, to a point today where the US is the essential mediator, postman, guarantor, engineer, and provider for incentives to these countries and leaders seeking a different relationship with Israel. And as for Israel in these 57 years, it has moved from being an ally to being a strategic asset and partner to the US and Western democracies, in part because the region has become much more unpredictable and unstable than it was in June 67. Asher, would you kick off our discussion and place your comments about Arab states and the Palestinians since 67 vis-a-vis Israel, and in the context of these 57 years?
The war of 1967 radically changed the region, needless to say, and essentially, over the last 57 years, has built a totally different Middle East that we face today in comparison to that which we faced in 1967. Israel went to war with 3 Arab states: Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The Palestinians were hardly a player in the war of 1967. It was about Israel and the Arab states. The non-Arab states of the region were not party to the game. Turkey and Iran were spoken of in those days as the periphery of the Middle East. Today, it is altogether different. The region has changed dramatically. First and foremost, I would say the Arab nationalism that dominated the ideological waves of the Middle East in the mid-1960s, the Arab nationalism as led by Egypt's President Abdel Nasser, so central to Arab nationalism was Abdel Nasser that the movement was even named after him and called Nasserism. The Six-Day War and Israel's dramatic victory, just the very name of the war says it all. 6 days and it was over. We're now in the 9th month of the present war and it is not over yet. Things have changed dramatically, as I said. The war of 1967, those dramatic 6 days, were essentially the beginning of the end of Pan-Arabism. Arab nationalism was a secular idea. It was about uniting the Arabs on the basis of the language they spoke, not their religion. People were Arabs because they spoke Arabic, not because they were Muslims. And Arab nationalism united Muslims with non-Muslims. Key Arab nationalist ideologues were Christians. The defeat of Arab nationalism paved the way for the rise of political Islam that has filled the void that Arab nationalism left behind it. Political Islam has weakened the Arab state. The more people are devoted to their religion, so religious sects and sectarianism in the Arab world weakens the Arab state. Countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria are countries that are falling apart at the seams due to sectarian differences that are highlighted by people's devotion to religion rather than to the language they speak. So you have a weaker Arab state. And with a weaker Arab state, the non-state actors become all the more powerful. Israel is at war with 2 or even 3 key non-state actors. Hamas, the key player in the weakness of Palestine, Hezbollah, emerging from the weakness of Lebanon, and the Houthis, emerging from the breakup of Yemen. So now it's not about powerful Arab states. It's about weak Arab states and powerful non-state actors. And the non-state actors are very difficult to defeat. It's not a question of air power and armored divisions, but facing Hamas and their rocketry, which reaches into the heart of Israel, which was not the case in 1967, where our home front was not penetrated at all. Today, it's all about the home front. The threat of Hezbollah to Israel today is not on the border with Lebanon, but what Hezbollah might do with its rocketry in Tel Aviv. So things have changed in every possible respect. And lastly, I will mention Palestine. In 1967, Palestinians were hardly players. But the war in 1967 and the defeat of the Arab states and Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza revived the Palestinian national movement. And if Israel thought that through the Abraham Accords with distant Arab states with whom we have never had war, Israel could ignore the Palestinian question, Israel could make peace with distant Arabs and leave the Palestinians to rest, that was a huge mistake. And the 7th of October awakened Israel to the enormity of this era of judgment. And it was this new Middle East that emerged from the wreckage of 1967 that Israel has to contend today. And one last remark, the centrality of a completely non-Arab player, Iran. It's not the Arab-Israeli conflict anymore. Our biggest and most dangerous enemy is not an Arab state at all, but Iran. They're not Arabs, they're Persians. So everything is very difficult and everything is very different. And Israel has a lot on its plate, and perhaps the most difficult period it has faced since 1948.
As always, Asher just beautifully summarizes what is a very complicated set of circumstances and brings the historical perspective to it, which is just great. So I want to try and maybe bring us up to this particular moment in terms of where the Abraham Accords countries see the current moment. But I actually want to do that maybe by speaking about America first. This event, after all, is dedicated in large part to examining the US-Israel relationship and how it has evolved over time. First of all, I would just say I coincidentally recently read Anita Shapira's biography of Ben-Gurion, which I highly recommend. It's just terrific. And there is a very interesting passage there where she talks about one of the evidently many disputes that Ben-Gurion had with Chaim Weizmann, who was, of course, another major Zionist leader. He became the first president of Israel once the state was declared. And they disagreed about a lot, apparently. But one of the things that they disagreed on was how to approach the American question. In other words, how to ensure that America would support at that stage, the idea even of a Jewish state, and ultimately really back Israel once it was created. And Weizmann took the view that, and this partly had to do, I think, with his ties to Britain and also his ties to American elites at the time. He took the view that you needed to build support for a Jewish state by having private, quiet discussions with elites in America. Ben-Gurion took a very different view and thought that the way to ensure that there would be robust American support for Israel was by appealing to public opinion in the United States. Because through public opinion, he believed, I think presciently and correctly, that you could get American political support for Israel that would be much more robust and much deeper. So it's just a little interesting historical tidbit. I think Ben-Gurion was proven correct in that. But it is important to remember that American support for Israel has, of course, never only come from Jewish citizens in the United States. They've never been numerous enough to have public opinion sway political outcomes. Much of Christian America has, for religious reasons and other reasons, also often been very supportive of Israel. So there's this very deep, long-standing identification with Israel in the US based in large part on values. But support has, of course, also been based on interests. And here's where we get to the 1967 war and aftermath. We like to recall that the US was the first. President Truman, of course, recognized the independent state of Israel almost immediately. But the truth is that really serious military and economic assistance for Israel really only came after the Six-Day War. And if you look at charts of military and economic assistance, it's really only in the 1970s that Israel starts to receive serious aid. This has to do with the question of interest in the kind of Cold War atmosphere that we were in. Israel was an important asset for the United States in this larger attempt to try and contain communism. I think after the end of the Cold War, Israel was a clear ally of the United States when it had to do with, for example, combating terrorism around the world. More recently, those interests have aligned over concerns about the rise of other great powers like China and Russia. And I think here Israel once again has represented an important regional asset for the United States in trying to push back against Chinese and Russian influence. And this business of great power competition that we're seeing today, I think also helps to explain, in part, the evolution in Israel's position in the region, including Arab states like those that signed the Abraham Accords. So one of the byproducts of the US wanting to kind of shift its attention to deal with great powers like China is that it has given the impression to a number of Arab states in the region that the US is essentially no longer interested in being involved in the Middle East. And so when they consider their real serious threat coming from Iran, they think to themselves, well, okay, if the US is on its way out, we can set aside for a moment the debate about whether that's actually true or not, but the perception is very powerful. Given that the US is increasingly preoccupied by China and other problems around the world, Ukraine now, how can we ensure that we are going to be in a secure enough position to handle threats such as Iran? Well, Israel presents an option for teaming up with a technologically, economically, and militarily, of course, superior power in the region. That, I think, was much of what drove the decision in 2020 for these states to sign Abraham Accords. But they also got really important gifts from the United States in signing those agreements. So that's one development that is worth highlighting. The second development I would just note in the last few years, and this will bring us up to October 7th, is the decision to bring Israel into U.S. Central Command. This isn't something that we talk about a lot, but the United States has obviously a number of combatant commands, and Israel was always in Europe Command. The decision to bring Israel into CENTCOM in 2021 meant that it was now going to be not only coordinating with the United States on military and security questions, but now it was going to be coordinating with all of the Arab states that fall under CENTCOM. And this was also seen as a real step toward increasing Israel's integration in the region, at least with the states like the UAE, Bahrain, and others that also fell under CENTCOM. We saw, I think, an indication of that coordination after October 7th in this attack in April that Iran launched, this very serious attack, the first of its kind. You had a direct Iranian attack on Israel. And the coordination that was demonstrated in the response, the fact that Israel, along with a hefty amount of American assistance, was able to repel that attack with assistance from Jordan, from other states in the region that preferred to keep their involvement less public. This was a big deal. This was a demonstration of efforts over a number of decades on the part of the US and others to try and increase the cooperation and coordination between Israel and its Arab partners. The last thing I will say is that I think that this triangle of the United States, Israel, and the Arab states in the region, I think of it as a Goldilocks situation for Israel. Israel has to remain strong enough to be both an attractive ally to regional states, as well as to the United States. The fact that the US started really lending serious assistance only after it saw that Israel was really capable of responding militarily in a quite impressive way in 1967, there's an advantage to Israel appearing to be very strong. But there are also liabilities involved in Israel appearing to be too strong because, first of all, it may inspire thoughts that, well, maybe Israel doesn't need really any assistance from the US anymore. It can also lead to more sort of nefarious views that Israel is becoming essentially an oppressor or the aggressor in the region. And so I think Israel often finds itself in this kind of tricky tension between wanting to be strong enough, but maybe not so strong that it will potentially undermine some of the alliances that it very much relies on.
We have the U.S. relationship with Israel and Arab states, and then we have the U.S. individual relationship with individual Arab states. And we saw that Jordan and Egypt, after October 7th, their leadership took a more measured public outlook than did their publics, who were identifying wholeheartedly with what Hamas did. In pursuit of understanding the U.S.-Israeli relationship or the U.S. relationship with Jordan, Asher, can you shed light on how Jordan managed its relationship with the Palestinians in what was really fraught for many years, right through the 1980s, into a position where it not only had a treaty with Israel, but the United States was a financial beneficiary to Jordan with the free trade agreement? In other words, how did the states in the region manage their relationships with their neighbors while they were also managing it with the United States and maybe secondarily Israel?
Well, the Jordanian example is a very good one for this very important question that you've asked. For Jordan, the whole issue of the relationship with Israel is a component of its relationship with the United States and Jordan's long-term security. Jordan has a vital interest, as opposed to other Arab states, in Israel's existence. Other Arab states have made their peace with Israel, but they don't have the same kind of interest in Israel's existence that Jordan does have. The problem is that since 1967, the Palestinian issue has emerged to such a degree to present the Jordanians with what they see as an existential threat. The possibility, or the danger as they would see it, that parties in the region may seek to solve the Palestinian question at Jordan's expense. The Jordan is Palestine thesis. There is a Palestinian national movement, nobody can deny that. Israel desperately needs to protect itself and to hang on to the West Bank for that purpose. And therefore, there are those in Israel and amongst Israel's supporters elsewhere who think that it would be a good idea for Israel to hang on to the West Bank and have the Palestinian question solved in Jordan, at Jordan's expense. You have a war now where there are important components of the Israeli government who speak of controlling Gaza and of pushing the Palestinians out of Gaza into Egypt. The Jordanians see that as a forerunner to a possible Israeli right-wing attempt to push the Palestinians out of the West Bank into Jordan. When the Jordanians made their peace with Israel, the idea from the Jordanian point of view was to secure a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians that would solve the Palestinian question in the West Bank and not in Jordan, and that would enable Jordan to extricate itself from its economic difficulties by having peace with Israel, which would create a better economic relationship with the United States and with Israel, and would solve Jordan's problems. None of these things materialized. And at present, the big question that arises is, how does the new situation, the emergence of Hamas, the ongoing war between Israel and Gaza, the possibility of a war between Israel and Hezbollah, to what extent can the Jordanians continue to rely on Israel as an anchor of Jordanian strategic security, where Israel is preoccupied by a multi-front war encouraged by Iran, taking Israel to Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, in a confrontation the likes of which Israel hasn't had to deal with, ever. So for Israel's neighbors, and especially for Jordan, this gives rise to questions that didn't even exist before. But this also creates new kinds of cooperation between Jordan and Israel, such as what Sarah mentioned before. When the Iranians made their attack on Israel, the Jordanians even publicized the fact that they participated in Israel's defense. Now, obviously, the participation of Jordan in Israel's defense was also defending Jordan at the same time. But it showed the interest that Jordan has in Israel's stability and in Israel's capacity to assist Jordan if Jordan faces times of stress, which may emerge from Iran through Iraq or Syria or from the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis in Yemen who close shipping to Eilat, close shipping to Aqaba also. And the port of Aqaba, which is Jordan's only port, is as damaged as Eilat is by the actions of the Houthis. They don't have Haifa as an alternative, except using it through Israel, but they don't have their own sovereign port somewhere else. So this is a very new situation which requires a host of new equations. A word about Israel-US. We always used to say, with great pride and with conviction, that Israel would defend itself by itself. That is no longer true. As the war began, the US fleets were in the Eastern Mediterranean. The attack by Iran in April, without the US component, it would have been far more difficult for Israel to defeat the Iranian assault. This is becoming a permanent feature of Israel's long-term security. So we are in the midst of a region that is changing, and within it, Israel's place is changing as well. The relationship between Israel and the Arab states, the relationship between Israel and the United States. Last word about Palestine. It has been said many times in Israel that the Arabs don't care about Palestine. And because the Arabs don't care about the Palestinians, Israel can afford to ignore the issue. It doesn't really matter. What I think Israelis have missed is the fact that the Arabs may not care about the Palestinians, and I don't think they really do care a great deal about the Palestinians. They do care about the Palestinian issue as an issue of regional security. And for that, they have great concern. And this war is an example of it. Even if the Saudis couldn't care a hoot about the Palestinians, the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza is a reason for regional insecurity. And that applies to Jordanians, Saudis, and other Arab states, Egypt certainly, who may not care much about the Palestinians, but who do care a great deal about the Palestinian issue and its impact on regional security, which affects them too.
When you say the Palestinian issue, Asher, you're referring to its resolution. Is that correct?
Resolution is a strong word, but definitely an effort to de-escalate the conflict, to find an arrangement that both sides can live with. I don't think we'll be able to resolve all the issues that separate us and the Palestinians in the foreseeable future, but we must create a better bilateral relationship other than all-out war, for our sake and for their sake, and for the sake of regional security. Take, for example, normalization with Saudi Arabia. It's not a question of whether the Saudis care about the Palestinians or not. It's, do the Saudis care about their regional security? And they certainly do. And here the Palestinian question figures far more prominently than many Israelis may have thought before the 7th of October.
We know that one of the reasons that Begin and Sadat reached an agreement is because their national interests were secured. One got a treaty, the other got his land back. And also motivating them or stimulating them both, catalyzing both, was this common worry, fear, anxiety about the Soviet Union. So there is this external threat that adds cement to this bilateralism. Iran's presence is not the Soviet Union. It's very different. It's located in the region. It's not further away. But Iran seems to be this external threat that sits over the head of regional states, which drives them to find ways to communicate with one another or create an arrangement. I know a couple people at INSS have even said, why not a defense treaty between Israel and the United States? Can you speak a little bit about the relationship of the Abraham Accord states with Israel, the substantive nature of that relationship that is deeper and broader than just the common external threat?
It was a bit different depending on which country you looked at. And I think this question applies to 2020 up until probably October 7th. I mean, none of the Abraham Accords countries has revoked their normalization agreement with Israel, which is I think, telling of something. But it did depend on where you looked. With the United Arab Emirates, for example, that was probably the most robust agreement. Substantively, if you read the normalization agreement, it really does read like pretty much a full peace treaty. Plans for economic cooperation, scientific research development together. So not just the presumed military and security cooperation and coordination, but a much more societal level engagement between these two peoples, between these two states. Now, how much of that actually came into fruition? First of all, we only had a few years of this. And in some areas, it was starting to develop. Trade had increased significantly with the UAE. There were a lot of Israelis going to the Emirates, but there weren't a lot of Emiratis coming to Israel just yet. When it came to Morocco, because of the number of Israelis whose parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had Moroccan roots, Israelis had actually been traveling to Morocco for decades. They always had to be in organized groups, but in that sense, actually, there had been a little bit more people-to-people engagement by the time you got the normalization agreement. Since the normalization agreement with Morocco, my understanding is that actually the security relationship has increased significantly. But again, I don't think we saw at least overt deepening of ties at a sort of societal level in terms of exchanges, for example, of university programs. There were steps in that direction, but it wasn't as significant. And then October 7th happened, and I think most things are on hold. What Asher mentioned about the relationship between Jordan and Israel, also partly being about Jordan and the United States, that I think is a dynamic that really could be said for all of these Arab states that decided to make peace or normalize relations with Israel. I mentioned that each of these countries got a very nice gift, in a sense, for signing a treaty with Israel back in 2020. In the case of the UAE, the gift was essentially a very serious security assistance package, including F-35 fighter planes from the US, again, with Iran in mind here. The Moroccans got the recognition of the Western Sahara as part of Moroccan sovereign territory. If and when the current war comes to, it's not a complete end, then at least sort of dies down enough for things to potentially resume. If they're going to manage to get close to normalization with Saudi Arabia, one presumes that the Saudis are going to need to get a very big gift for this as well. And I suspect that if beforehand what the Saudis were asking of Israel in terms of steps toward a resolution with the Palestinians, because I agree with Asher that from the standpoint of these regional leaders anyway, the Palestinian issue, I don't think there's much sentimental attachment, but I think that they see this as an issue that can just explode every few years, and then the region just completely goes haywire. And it's linked to Iran increasingly. We know that Iran has been supporting, funding, arming these non-state actors like Hamas, like Hezbollah. So I think for regional actors, the leaders anyway, this is all connected. So whereas before October 7th, I think the Saudi leadership would have been content to get Israel's commitment to a kind of vague but a broad commitment to ultimately some resolution to the Palestinian conflict. It's likely that today they feel in Riyadh that they're going to need more than that, just given the images of Gaza that most of their citizens are seeing since October.
In 1967, we had not a great American involvement in the region. We had Saudi Arabia and Iran as pillars of our relationship with the region. There was a great deal of stability in the Middle East in terms of the Arab states with pretty strong leaders. Some of the leaders had been there for a long period of time and would continue for several decades. And now, Asher, you speak about the splintering of Arab states. You speak about them weak. It's not just you, it's analysts in general about the state structures under enormous duress, whether it's economic, demographic, It appears from my point of view anyway, that the United States is much more involved in the Middle East today than it was in 1967 in many dimensions. Will the United States be engaged, do you think, in trying to keep these states from splintering? Or is it not in the U.S. interest and only for the U.S. to be sure that Iran doesn't go completely haywire and control all of this area and therefore really put oil under a greater influence than it now has? Seems to me whoever's president of the United States is going to have to deal with the Middle East regardless because of the instability.
I think you're right, but the reasons for American involvement have changed. Middle Eastern oil is not the key issue anymore, as far as the United States is concerned. In fact, unfortunately, from the United States point of view, one of the US interventions in the Middle East, the invasion of Iraq, accelerated the splintering of Arab states and has only made things considerably worse. Saddam's Iraq, as awful as it may have been, was the gatekeeper of the Sunni Arab East. It is now an Iranian-influenced state. Iran now has a footprint all the way from Tehran to the Mediterranean. This never existed at any time in the modern era, and it's not going to be easy to reverse it. What is the balance of power between Iran and Israel going to look like when this war is over? Is Israel going to come out dramatically on top, like after the war in June 67, or somewhat bloodied and battered? Things have changed in the nature of warfare. The main difference is that the home front in Israel is more vulnerable than it has ever been ever since the creation of the state. And this is changing the regional balance of power. And it's going to be very difficult for the United States to block this Iranian advance if the Arab states that are anti-Iran do not form this coalition and alliance of states with Israel as part of it. Whether all of that is going to emerge, who knows? Are the Gulf states going to be more prepared to align themselves against Iran or less prepared out of fear of Iran? These are questions, the answers of which we don't know.
We sort of tend to forget now because we're in the throes of this war, but actually just building on what Asher was saying a moment ago, one of the reasons that Israel has sought the level of security and military assistance from the United States and has sought to demonstrate to the world, really, that it is a very, very close ally of America's. Of course, there is a deep level of just kind of cultural and almost personal affinity between the peoples of these two countries. But it has also traditionally been, in large part, to deter regional actors who might get it into their heads that the state of Israel is weak and vulnerable. And I think one reason why the current war is so upsetting is that there's a real concern about whether that deterrent capability is going to remain intact. But here too, there's always this sort of dilemma when President Biden, the fact that he was in the White House when this happened is really one of, I think, very, very few, perhaps lucky elements of this whole thing for Israel. But when the United States sends aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean, well, what are they really doing? What they're really trying to do is deter actors like Iran, probably Hezbollah, others from joining in the fray. Now, on the one hand, you can say, okay, wow, this is like the envy of most of these Arab states. When Saudi Arabia was attacked in 2019, the Iranians sent missiles to their major oil installations, took out a big chunk. That's economically very serious for Saudi Arabia at that moment anyway. There was not much response on the part of the US or frankly anybody else. The contrast between that and what the Biden administration has shown and provided for Israel since October 7th, Riyadh and others look at this and can only dream of such a thing. But there's a but here because, again, from Israel's standpoint, you want to demonstrate a close alliance with a great power, but you also run the risk. And here too, Asher, you alluded to this, at least indirectly, you run the risk of basically sending the signal, we can't do this, we are too weak. There's always a risk that in the eyes of Israel's adversaries, that's going to invite more risky behavior. So it's a precarious moment, but I still remain optimistic, not only about the US-Israel relationship, but still even about Israel's prospects.
The major difference between Israel and Saudi Arabia was when the Saudis were attacked, they didn't respond. Not only the United States didn't respond, the Saudis didn't respond. Israel did respond, and some may say Israel overreacted, that the Israel response is too much of a response. But what this requires of Israel now is to do some rethinking. If we need a greater measure of American involvement in Israel's strategic defense, we also need a greater measure of Israeli cooperation with regional US thinking. And that is becoming ever more apparent, where the Biden administration has certain ideas about what ought to be done, and the Netanyahu government has other ideas altogether. And this is making the relationship very difficult. And at times, even encouraging the US administration to threaten Israel to withdraw support. So here, again, there is a new equation which is emerging, and Israel has to do some rethinking about how its regional policy has to be aligned with that of the United States, more so than it used to be in the past, if we want to have serious regional strategic cooperation.
As you found out today, our webinars are full of insights with remarkable people. We engage in information, we engage in learning. Join us on the israeled.org website. If you like what you heard, you like what you see, you like what you learn, you can contribute to our work by hitting the donate button on the homepage. We like to think that one of the best contributions we can make is to make people smarter and more aware and ask good questions, and don't do it with polemics or disinformation. As you found today from Moshe and Sarah, two of the brightest we have in the world who understand Israel's relationship with its neighbors in the Middle East.